I stood at the entrance to my father's study, my hand frozen on the brass doorknob that still smelled faintly of his cologne, sandalwood and tobacco, listening to Miguel's voice drift through the crack in the door. He was on the phone, and something in his tone made my stomach clench with the same instinct that had kept me vigilant throughout our childhood, always watching for the moment he'd claim credit for my homework or charm. Our father into believing I'd broken something he'd shattered himself. "The probate lawyer doesn't suspect anything," Miguel said, his voice carrying that smooth confidence that had always made people trust him, made them overlook the calculations behind his dark eyes. I pressed closer to the door, my breath catching in my throat as the October sunlight streaming through the hallway window suddenly felt cold against my skin. This was my father's house, our father's house, where I'd returned 3 weeks after his funeral to help settle his affairs, where every corner held memories of trying to earn a love that always seemed just out of reach, always conditional on being someone I wasn't. "No, I handled the signatures myself," Miguel continued, and I heard papers rustling. "Dad's handwriting was easy enough to copy after all these years. The new will leaves everything to me, the business, the estate, all of it." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I grabbed the doorframe, my fingers digging into the carved wood that my grandfather had installed in 1962, when he'd first opened Alvarez Fine Antiques in a tiny storefront in Pasadena. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out whatever Miguel said next, but I forced myself to stay quiet, to keep listening, even as betrayal burned through my chest like acid. "She's always been Dad's disappointment anyway," Miguel laughed, and that sound, casual, dismissive, cut deeper than any of the deliberate cruelties we'd inflicted on each other growing up. "He told me himself right before he died, said she chose paintings over family, that she abandoned the business for some pretentious career." I backed away from the door, my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. The hallway stretched before me, lined with the artifacts of our family history. 18th century oil paintings, Ming Dynasty vases, Art Deco sculptures, each piece a testament to 4 generations of Alvarez expertise in identifying, acquiring, and selling beauty. I'd grown up learning to authenticate Renaissance pottery before I could multiply fractions, spent my teenage weekends at estate sales instead of the mall, and I'd loved every minute of it until my father made it clear that loving the art wasn't enough. He'd wanted me to love the business, the wheeling and dealing, the cold calculation of profit margins. He'd wanted me to be Miguel. I moved on autopilot down the stairs, past the formal living room where we'd held the wake 3 weeks ago, where 70 people had told me how sorry they were, while Miguel had stood beside our father's casket like a crown prince accepting condolences. My hands shook as I grabbed my purse from the entryway table, my car keys cutting into my palm as I clenched them tight enough to hurt. The late afternoon air outside was thick with the scent of jasmine from the neighbor's garden, absurdly sweet and alive while my world crumbled. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, maybe 20, watching the Spanish colonial revival house where I'd grown up, where my mother had died when I was 8 and Miguel was 12, where my father had raised us with high expectations and higher walls around his affection. My phone buzzed, a text from Miguel. "Where did you go?" "The auction, of course. The prestigious November sale at the Huntington estate. My father's final coup. a collection he'd spent 2 years assembling from a railroad magnate's abandoned mansion in San Marino. 50 lots of museum-quality pieces with an estimated value of over $3 million. The auction that was supposed to be his legacy, the event that would cement Alvarez Fine Antiques as the premier house west of Christie's. The event Miguel was planning to claim as his own, built on a foundation of forgery and lies. I started the engine, my mind already working through the implications, the timeline, the evidence I'd need. My apartment in downtown Los Angeles was 40 minutes away in traffic, but I barely registered the drive, my thoughts churning with memories I'd spent years trying to reframe in a gentler light. I remembered being 14, showing my father the acceptance letter from the Saturday art program at LACMA. How his face had fallen in disappointment even as he'd said congratulations. I remembered being 22, telling him I'd been offered a curatorial position at the Getty, watching him turn back to his ledgers without a word, while Miguel smirked from across the dinner table. I remembered last Christmas, the last time I'd seen my father healthy, when he'd toasted Miguel's success in acquiring a Tiffany lamp collection and hadn't mentioned the Renaissance Art Symposium I'd organized that had been featured in the Los Angeles Times. But I also remembered him teaching me to identify authentic Roseville pottery by the weight and feel of the glaze, his rare smile when I'd correctly dated a piece of Chippendale furniture at age 10, the way he'd once called me his little connoisseur before he'd decided that wasn't enough. I couldn't let Miguel erase me from this legacy. Not like this. Not with forged documents and casual dismissals of everything I'd loved about our family's work. My apartment felt too small, too quiet after the sprawling house in San Marino. I paced between my kitchen and living room, both barely larger than my father's study, surrounded by the art prints and auction catalogs that had become my real family over the years. My laptop sat on the dining table, and I opened it with shaking hands, pulling up the law firm's website where my father had supposedly filed his will 3 months before his death. 3 months. He'd been in the hospital for 2 of those months, his heart failing slowly, and I'd visited every Tuesday and Thursday evening after work, sitting beside his bed while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Miguel had come on weekends, always bringing food from our father's favorite restaurants, always knowing exactly what to say to make the nurses love him. I pulled up my calendar, cross-referencing the date on the will filing. August 15th. I'd been at the hospital that day. I had a photo on my phone of my father asleep, taken because the evening light through the window had cast his face in such soft relief that he'd looked peaceful for the first time in weeks. The timestamp read 4 p.m. The will had been filed at 3 p.m. in Pasadena, according to the public records. My father had been unconscious in Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. The proof was there, simple and damning. But was it enough? I spent the next 3 hours combing through everything I could access online: probate records, business filings, the law firm's information. The attorney who'd supposedly witnessed the will was named Richard Chen, a junior partner at Westwood Estate Services. I called the office, knowing it was past business hours, and left a carefully worded voicemail saying I was Sophia Alvarez, calling about my father's estate, and could Mr. Chen please return my call at his earliest convenience. Hundreds of images appeared, a visual timeline of decline and distance, but I was looking for something specific: his handwriting. I found it in a birthday card from 3 years ago, in a photo of a shopping list he'd asked me to pick up during one of his hospital stays, in a sticky note visible in the background of a video Miguel had posted to Facebook. I compared them to the copy of the will that Miguel had emailed me last week, the one I'd barely glanced at through my grief. The signatures looked similar at first glance, but when I zoomed in, I could see the differences. The A in Alvarez was too perfect, too controlled. My father's handwriting had become shakier in his final year, a tremor he'd tried to hide, but that showed up in every letter he wrote. The signature on this will had no tremor. It was a copy of his signature from years earlier, probably traced from a business document. Miguel had been sloppy, or maybe he'd been arrogant, assuming I wouldn't look closely enough to notice. My phone rang, making me jump. An unknown number. I answered, my heart pounding. Ms. Alvarez, this is Richard Chen returning your call. His voice was young, professional, slightly uncertain. I glanced at the clock. 8:45. Thank you for calling back, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. I had some questions about my father's will. A pause. Eduardo Alvarez. Another pause, longer this time. Miss Alvarez, I don't recall witnessing any will on that date. My hands were shaking again, but this time with something other than shock. This time with the electric anticipation of a curator who just spotted a fake in a collection of authenticated pieces. He called back in 7 minutes. Ms. Alvarez, I've checked my calendar and my files. I was in San Francisco on August 15th for a wedding. I couldn't have witnessed any documents that day. So someone forged your signature too, I said quietly. He stopped. I'm very concerned about what you're suggesting. I think you should contact the managing partner at my firm immediately. I will. Thank you, Mr. I hung up and sat in the silence of my apartment, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Traffic on the 110, a helicopter overhead, someone's television through the thin walls. Evidence was mounting, but I knew how these things worked. Miguel would have backup plans, would have covered his tracks in ways I hadn't discovered yet. And if I went to the police now, if I started an official investigation, he'd have time to prepare. Time to create a narrative where I was the jealous younger sister making false accusations. No, I needed more than proof of forgery. I needed to understand what Miguel was really planning, what other lies he'd built into his foundation. And I needed to hurt him the way he'd hurt me, not just financially, but in his reputation, in the legacy he was so desperate to claim. I pulled up the inventory for the Huntington Estate auction, scrolling through 50 lots of carefully cataloged items. My father had let me help with the initial assessment, back before his final hospitalization, back when I'd thought maybe we were finally finding common ground in our shared love of the work. I'd spent a weekend going through the collection, photographing pieces, making notes on provenance and condition, and I'd found something that had troubled me. Lot 23, a supposedly 18th century Italian credenza with elaborate marquetry work. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the materials appropriate to the period, but something about the patina had seemed wrong to me. Too uniform, too carefully aged. I'd mentioned it to my father, suggested we get a second opinion from a wood dating specialist, and he'd waved me off impatiently, said I was being paranoid, said the provenance was impeccable. I pulled up the lot description now, reading the details with fresh eyes. Documented sale from the Medici collection, 1784. I zoomed in on the photograph of the bill of sale. The paper looked appropriately aged, the ink faded to brown. But the handwriting, I grabbed my phone, searching for examples of 18th century Italian business documents. The letter forms were wrong, subtle but wrong. The F had a modern tail. The S wasn't long enough. My heart started pounding harder. If this piece was a fake, if my father had known or suspected and sold it anyway, that was fraud. And if Miguel was planning to proceed with the sale knowing it was fake, he was complicit. But more than that, if I could prove the credenza was fake, I could demand an independent authentication of the entire collection. I could delay the auction, maybe derail it entirely, buying myself time to expose Miguel's forgery of the will. But I needed to be sure. I needed proof that would hold up under scrutiny. I pulled up my contacts and scrolled to Elena Vasquez, a wood conservation specialist I'd worked with on a Getty exhibition 2 years ago. We'd bonded over a shared obsession with dendrochronology and bad coffee. I sent her a text. "Are you still in LA? Need your expertise on a rush project." Her response came 3 minutes later. "In Pasadena for a job tomorrow anyway." Perfect. I spent the rest of the night building my case file, documenting everything I'd found, cross-referencing dates and documents. At some point, I made tea that went cold on my desk. At some point, the city outside my window shifted from evening bustle to late-night quiet to the pre-dawn stillness that I'd always loved, when Los Angeles held its breath before the day began. By the time sunlight started filtering through my blinds, I had a plan. Not complete, not perfect, but the beginnings of something that might work. Something that would require me to be careful, strategic, and willing to risk everything on the chance that I could outmaneuver my brother at the game he'd been playing our entire lives. I showered, put on my most professional outfit, a navy silk blouse and tailored pants that my best friend Rachel always said made me look like I could authenticate a Rembrandt and then negotiate world peace, and drove to Pasadena in the early morning traffic. The coffee shop Elena had suggested was a tiny place near the Caltech campus, crowded with students and professors engaged in intense conversations about things I couldn't begin to understand. Elena was already there, her silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun, her reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. "You look terrible," she said by way of greeting, which was how I knew we were really friends. Her face immediately shifted to concern. "Sophia, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If this isn't a good time." "No, it's connected." I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around the coffee she'd already ordered for me. Oat milk latte, extra shot, because she remembered. "I need you to examine a piece from his final collection." I explained about the credenza, about my concerns, watching her face shift from sympathy to professional interest as I described the details. She leaned forward. "What's your father's reputation like?" That question hurt more than it should have, given everything I'd learned about Miguel's forgery. No, he was scrupulous about authentication, but he was sick when he acquired this collection, and he might have missed something. I hesitated. I didn't mention Miguel. Not yet. Elena was a professional contact, not a confidant, and I needed to keep my accusations contained until I was ready to deploy them. Elena asked, "I'll need to take samples? Run tests?" The collection is being stored at my father's warehouse. I hoped that was true. Miguel hadn't changed the locks yet, hadn't formally taken over the business. Tomorrow afternoon? We spent another 30 minutes discussing the technical details of what she'd need to examine, what tests would be conclusive, how long results would take. By the time we parted, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt since that terrible moment outside my father's study: hope. The Alvarez Fine Antiques warehouse was in an industrial part of Pasadena, a climate-controlled space where my father had stored pieces waiting for sale or restoration. I'd spent hundreds of hours here growing up, learning to rewire antique lamps and touch up veneer damage, listening to my father explain the difference between aesthetic restoration and fraud. "We preserve history," he'd told me once, running his hand over a scarred Victorian desk. But Miguel had rewritten our family history with a forged will. What else might he have rewritten? My key still worked in the warehouse lock, and the alarm code was unchanged. Inside, the familiar smell of old wood and lemon polish filled my lungs, bringing a wave of memories so sharp they almost knocked me over. I stood in the entrance, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the high windows, trying to separate my love for this place from my complicated feelings about the man who'd built it. The Huntington Estate collection occupied the entire back section, each piece carefully wrapped and cataloged. I found Lot 23 and carefully removed its protective covering, running my hands over the marquetry work. It was beautiful. A scene of classical ruins executed in 5 different wood tones, the kind of craftsmanship that took months to complete. If it was fake, it was an extraordinary fake, but something about it still felt wrong. I pulled out my phone and took detailed photographs from every angle, capturing the way the light hit the surface, the patterns in the wood grain, the construction of the drawer joints. Miguel's voice made me spin around, my heart lurching into my throat. He stood in the warehouse doorway, silhouetted against the morning sun, and even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I could hear the suspicion in his voice. "Checking on the collection," I said, forcing my voice to stay casual even as my pulse hammered in my ears. He moved closer, and I could see his expression now. The dark eyes we'd both inherited from our father, the strong jaw, the careful grooming that made him look like a successful businessman even in casual clothes. "You should have asked me first. It's still Dad's business." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and assertive, nothing like the gentle scent our father had worn. "Because from what I understand, you've never been particularly interested in the business side of things." The casual dismissal, the rewriting of our shared history. It took every ounce of control I had not to throw my evidence in his face right then. But I couldn't. Not yet. "Dad and I worked on this collection together," I said instead, before he got too sick. Something flickered in Miguel's eyes. Concern, maybe, or calculation. Authentication notes, provenance research. That last part was almost true. He'd tolerated my help at least. "I'd like to see those notes," Miguel said smoothly, "for the catalog descriptions." The irony of him talking about accuracy while standing on a foundation of forgery would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. "Of course," I said. "I'll send them over." Thursday at the house. He was already turning away, already dismissing me. Don't come here without telling me again, Sophia. Security, you know. I waited until he was gone, until I heard his car engine start and fade into the distance, before I allowed myself to lean against the credenza and take a shaking breath. He knew I suspected something. Or at least, he knew I was paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I'd have to be more careful. But I'd also learned something valuable. He was worried about my notes, which meant he knew, or suspected, that something in this collection wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. I photographed 3 more pieces that I'd had questions about. A supposedly colonial-era cabinet that might be a 19th century reproduction, a set of Ming bowls that could be later copies, and an oil painting attributed to a minor Dutch master that my instincts said was wrong. Then I locked up carefully and drove back to my apartment, my mind already working through the implications. That night, I pulled up every digital record I could find of my father's recent acquisitions. Bank statements I'd been given as part of the estate settlement, purchase orders from the last year, correspondence with dealers and collectors. Miguel had been surprisingly forthcoming with these documents, probably because he'd assumed I wouldn't know what to look for. But I did know. I'd grown up in this business, even if I'd chosen a different path. And what I found made my blood run cold. The Huntington Estate collection hadn't been acquired gradually over 2 years, the way the official story went. According to the bank records, my father had made a single massive purchase 6 months ago, right before his final hospitalization, from a dealer I'd never heard of. $2 million, wired to an account held by something called Heritage Acquisitions LLC. I searched for Heritage Acquisitions and found a website so generic it looked like a template. Stock photos, vague descriptions of premier estate services. No physical address beyond a P.O. box in Delaware. No history of major auction sales. No presence in any of the professional organizations or networks that legitimate dealers belong to. My hands shook as I dug deeper, searching for connections, for any paper trail that would tell me what my father had bought, and from whom. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Heritage Acquisitions LLC had been registered 5 months before the purchase. The registered agent was listed as Miguel Alvarez. My brother had created a fake company, sold my father a collection of suspicious antiques, and taken $2 million from the business. And now he was planning to auction those same pieces, possibly knowing they were fakes or reproductions, to unsuspecting buyers who trusted the Alvarez name. This wasn't just about forging the will. This was systematic fraud, the kind that could destroy the business my grandfather had built, that could land Miguel in federal prison. And I had to decide what I was going to do about it. I spent the next 2 days researching, planning, and trying to act normal in my texts with Miguel about the auction schedule. Elena called to confirm our appointment at the warehouse, and I arranged to meet her there on Tuesday afternoon, when Miguel would be at a meeting with the auction house publicist. A meeting I knew about because I'd asked to join and been politely excluded. I think it's best if I handle the public-facing aspects, Miguel had said on the phone, his tone implying that I wasn't polished enough, wasn't business savvy enough, wasn't enough. I understood perfectly. Tuesday dawned overcast and cool, the kind of November day that Los Angeles pretended was autumn. I met Elena at the warehouse at 2, and she arrived with enough equipment to carbon date the Last Supper. "If this piece is fake, we'll know," she promised, setting up her portable microscope and sample collection tools. I watched her work, documenting everything with photographs and notes, as she carefully extracted tiny samples from inconspicuous areas, inside a drawer, behind the decorative molding, under the base. She examined the wood grain patterns, the tool marks, the construction techniques. She took scrapings of the finish and sealed them in labeled containers. After 3 hours, she sat back and pulled off her magnifying headset. "I'll need to run the lab tests to be certain, but Sophia, your instincts are good. The wood species are consistent with 18th century Italian furniture, but the construction isn't. These drawer joints use a technique that wasn't common until the 1920s. She pointed to one of her samples. My stomach dropped even as my mind raced ahead. A very good reproduction, probably from the early 20th century. Absolutely an antique in its own right, worth money, but not nearly what it would be worth as an authentic 18th century piece. "Shy?" I asked. We spent another 4 hours in the warehouse, Elena working with focused precision, while I kept checking my phone for any indication Miguel was coming back early. By the time we finished, as the sun set and the temperature dropped, Elena had devastating news. "At least 6 of these pieces are misattributed or outright fake," she said. "The painting is particularly concerning. It's trying to look 17th century, but the canvas preparation is wrong, the pigments are wrong, everything is wrong. It's probably from the 1800s at earliest, maybe later." "I'm not planning to sell them," I said quietly. Elena looked at me sharply. "I think he more than knows." I took a breath. 2 days for preliminary findings. "I need it in 2 days. And Elena, this needs to be airtight." She studied my face. "Justice," I said. I spent those 2 days gathering every piece of evidence I could compile. I hired a forensic document examiner to analyze my father's signature on the will, a retired FBI analyst named Dr. Patricia Walsh, who came highly recommended and very expensive. I paid her rush rate without flinching, using money from my savings account that I'd been setting aside for a down payment on a house someday. That dream seemed absurdly distant now, irrelevant compared to the necessity of exposing the truth. Dr. Walsh confirmed what I'd suspected. The signature was forged, likely traced from an older document. "The pressure patterns are wrong," she explained, showing me microscopic photographs. "A genuine signature has variation in pressure as the hand moves naturally." I contacted Richard Chen's managing partner at the law firm, explaining what I'd discovered, providing documentation. The partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Torres, listened with increasing alarm and promised a full internal investigation. "If one of our attorney's signatures was forged on a will, Ms. Alvarez, we take that very seriously," she said. "I need to ask you to wait," I said. "Just a few days." She hesitated. "I can give you 1 week." I also made an appointment with a probate attorney of my own, not at my father's firm, but at a completely separate practice that specialized in contested estates. The attorney, a calm man in his 60s named James Rothstein, reviewed my evidence with increasing concern. "You have a strong case for fraud," he said. "The forged signatures alone would be enough to invalidate the will. But Sophia, you need to understand, this is going to be ugly. Family litigation always is, but when there's fraud involved, When there's this much money at stake, it gets worse. Your brother will fight back hard. I thought about the little girl who'd tried so hard to earn her father's love, who'd competed with her brother for scraps of approval, who'd finally chosen her own path and been punished for it with dismissal and disappointment. I thought about that girl and felt a wave of tenderness for her, mixed with something fiercer. "I've been fighting my whole life," I said. The auction was scheduled for November 20th, 3 weeks away. The preview exhibition would open November 15th at the Huntington Estate itself, a prestigious venue that my father had secured through years of relationship building with the institution. It would be attended by serious collectors, museum representatives, and members of the press. Everyone who mattered in the Southern California art and antiques world. It would be the perfect venue to reveal the truth. But first, I needed one more piece of evidence, proof that Miguel had deliberately deceived our father, that he'd knowingly acquired fake pieces through his shell company. I needed to trace where the collection had actually come from. I called in a favor from a journalist friend, Marcus Chen, who specialized in investigative pieces about art fraud for the Los Angeles Times. We'd met when I'd helped him with background research for an article about fake pre-Columbian artifacts flooding the market. "I need you to trace a wire transfer," I told him over coffee at a downtown cafe, sliding a folder across the table. $2 million from Alvarez Fine Antiques to a company called Heritage Acquisitions. Marcus flipped through the documents I'd compiled, bank records, the LLC registration, everything I'd found. His eyebrows rose higher with each page. It was my father's business. He let out a low whistle. "I can trace this, but it'll take time. Wire transfers through shell companies usually involve multiple hops. I have 1 week." He looked at me curiously. I told him, not everything, but enough. About the forged will, the fake antiques, the upcoming auction that would destroy my family's reputation if it proceeded as planned. About wanting to expose Miguel's fraud in a way that would not only bring legal consequences, but make it impossible for him to ever work in this industry again. "You want to burn him down publicly," Marcus said slowly. "I want the truth to come out in front of everyone who matters. I want collectors to know that Miguel Alvarez tried to defraud them. I want our father's real legacy, the one of integrity and scholarship, to be protected." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "I'll make some calls. I have contacts who can expedite this kind of research. But Sophia, you'll have it. But Marcus, nothing gets published until after I confront him." The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I went to work at the Getty, curating an exhibition of Baroque paintings and pretending everything was normal while my phone burned with updates. Elena sent her preliminary report. 6 pieces definitively misattributed or fake, another 4 suspicious pending additional testing. Dr. Walsh sent her forensic analysis of the forged signature. Marcus called with updates on the wire transfer, tracing it through 3 shell companies before hitting a dead end at a Cayman Islands account. "But here's the interesting part," he said. "One of the intermediate companies has Miguel listed as a director." And throughout it all, I maintained text conversations with Miguel about the auction, playing the role of the supportive younger sister who was sad about Dad, but excited about the prestigious sale. It made me feel sick, that duplicity, but I'd learned from the master. Miguel had been playing roles our entire lives: the devoted son, the responsible older brother, the heir apparent. I could play one for a few more days. On November 13th, 2 days before the preview exhibition, I received the final piece I'd been waiting for. Marcus called, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. I found the source of the collection. Sophia, your brother didn't just buy suspicious antiques from himself through a shell company. He bought stolen goods. The Huntington Estate collection, or at least the best pieces in it, were reported stolen from a private collection in Turin, Italy, 18 months ago. The theft was never solved, but the pieces were flagged in the art loss register. My hands went numb. And he's about to sell it at auction under your family's name. The reputation damage would be catastrophic. The legal consequences could be federal. Receiving stolen goods, wire fraud, money laundering. I thought about confronting Miguel at the preview, about my careful plan to expose him in front of collectors and press. Suddenly it seemed inadequate. This was bigger than family betrayal, bigger than a forged will. This was serious crime, the kind that destroyed lives and legacies. I need to go to the police, I said. Marcus's voice was urgent. If you tip him off before the preview, he might destroy evidence or flee. The stolen pieces are still in the warehouse, right? That's physical evidence. The preview is just for show. No sales happen until the actual auction. You confront him at the preview, make the fraud public, and I'll have a photographer there. The story breaks that night, and by morning, law enforcement will have no choice but to act. You'll be the whistleblower, the one who saved your family's reputation by exposing the truth. It was risky. It meant waiting 2 more days while Miguel remained free, while the stolen pieces sat in that warehouse vulnerable to discovery or disposal. But it also meant controlling the narrative, making sure the truth came out in a way that protected my father's real legacy and gave me a chance to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Okay, I said, 2 more days. I spent those final days preparing my evidence packet, organizing every document, every photograph, every expert report into a comprehensive presentation. I made copies, physical and digital, and distributed them to trusted locations. One set to James Rothstein, my attorney, one to Elena, one in a safe deposit box, one uploaded to a cloud server with instructions to automatically send to law enforcement if I didn't access it within 24 hours. I wasn't taking chances. Not anymore. The morning of November 15th dawned clear and cold, the kind of perfect Southern California day that made postcards look honest. I put on my best dress, a black sheath that Rachel said made me look like a woman who could buy and sell souls, and my mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I had of hers. Dutch courage from a woman I barely remembered, but who I hoped would have been proud of what I was about to do. The Huntington estate was breathtaking in the morning light, its garden still green despite the late season, its historic mansion gleaming with careful preservation. The main gallery where the preview would be held had been transformed, each lot displayed with museum-quality lighting and placards, servers circulating with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, classical music playing softly from hidden speakers. It looked like success, like prestige, like the culmination of my father's life work. It looked like a beautiful lie. Miguel was holding court near the entrance, resplendent in a tailored suit, charming a cluster of prominent collectors with anecdotes about our father's legendary eye for quality. I watched him from across the room, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as the golden child I'd competed with, not as the brother I'd loved and resented, but as a criminal who'd betrayed everything we'd supposedly valued. I caught his eye, and he smiled, waving me over. Playing the part of the united family, the loyal siblings carrying on their father's legacy together. I walked toward him slowly, my heart pounding but my hands steady. The collectors greeted me warmly. Some of them remembered me from childhood visits to the warehouse, from estate sales where I'd helped catalog items. They offered condolences about my father, praise for the impressive collection. "Your father had such an eye," one woman said, a museum curator I'd known professionally for years. "This credenza alone, 18th century Italian marquetry of this quality, is so rare," I said, looking at Miguel. He met my gaze steadily, confidently. He thought he'd won. "That's interesting." The conversation around us quieted. Miguel's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. I raised my voice slightly, enough that nearby conversations paused, enough that heads turned. "Because that credenza isn't 18th century, it's a 20th century reproduction." The silence spread like ripples on water, conversations stopping in widening circles until the entire gallery was quiet except for the classical music that now seemed absurdly cheerful. Miguel's face flushed. I pulled a folder from my bag. I'd been carrying it all morning, waiting for this moment. "Lot 23 is misattributed. So are lots 31, 47, 18, 22, and 53. I had them examined by Elena Vasquez, one of the top wood conservation specialists in the country. Her report is here. The credenza is early 20th century. The colonial cabinet is 19th century. The painting attributed to a Dutch master is actually a Victorian copy." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. The museum curator took a step back from the credenza as if it had betrayed her personally. Miguel's face went from red to white. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The provenance documents are fake." I turned to address the room, to speak to every collector, every journalist, every person whose opinion mattered in our world. "My brother forged our father's will to claim the entire estate. He created a shell company to funnel money out of the business." The gallery erupted. Shocked exclamations, urgent questions, the sound of someone calling the police. Miguel tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but I kept going, my voice carrying over the chaos. "I have documentation for everything. Forensic analysis of the forged signature. Expert authentication reports on the suspicious pieces. Bank records showing the shell company transactions." I held up the folder. "I'm turning everything over to law enforcement, but I wanted everyone here to know the truth first. Alvarez Fine Antiques was built on integrity. My grandfather, my father, they believed in preserving history honestly. My brother tried to destroy that legacy for profit." Miguel lunged toward me, but 2 security guards intervened, holding him back. His face was twisted with fury and fear, all his careful charm stripped away to reveal the desperation underneath. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed at me. "Dad would have wanted me to have the business. You abandoned us for your precious museums." "Maybe not," I said quietly, holding his gaze. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Marcus had tipped them off, had them standing by. They took my evidence, took statements, and eventually took Miguel away in handcuffs for questioning. I stood in that beautiful gallery surrounded by objects that had promised to be treasures and turned out to be lies. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just an overwhelming exhaustion and a strange sense of grief for the family we'd never quite managed to be. The aftermath took weeks to fully unfold. Miguel was formally charged with forgery, fraud, and receiving stolen goods. The Huntington estate auction was canceled. The legitimate pieces from the collection were eventually sold through another auction house, with the proceeds going into the estate that would be redistributed once the probate case was settled. The stolen items were returned to their rightful owners in Italy. The will forgery was overturned, and my father's actual last will was located, the real one, filed 2 years before his death, that split the estate and business equally between Miguel and me. It turned out that despite everything, despite my choices and his disappointment, my father had believed I deserved an equal share of what he'd built. That hurt in a different way than the betrayal, a bittersweet ache for conversations we'd never have, for understanding that came too late. I stood in my father's study 6 weeks after the disastrous preview, sorting through papers and memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. The house was quiet. Miguel was out on bail but staying with a friend, avoiding me, and we'd agreed to sell the property and split the proceeds. There was no salvaging our relationship, no path back to even the fractious siblinghood we'd once shared. But I'd salvaged something more important. The legitimate pieces from my father's collection had sold well. Several museums had reached out, interested in collaborating with me on future acquisitions. My role in exposing the fraud had earned me a reputation for integrity that opened doors I hadn't expected. And I'd started consulting with auction houses on authentication, using my curatorial expertise to help prevent exactly the kind of fraud Miguel had attempted. I picked up a photograph from my father's desk, the 3 of us, taken maybe 20 years ago, before my mother died, when things had been simpler, or at least I'd been too young to see the complications. We looked happy. Maybe we had been, in that moment, in whatever way we'd been capable of. My phone buzzed, a text from Rachel. "Dinner tonight?" I smiled despite myself. Revenge is off the menu now. I set the photograph back on the desk and looked around the study one last time. This room had witnessed so much. My father's triumphs and frustrations, Miguel's plotting, my devastating discovery. But it had also held moments of beauty, of shared passion for art and history, of a legacy that was worth fighting for. I'd fought. I'd won, though it felt less like victory than survival. And now I had the chance to build something new from the pieces that remained. Not my father's vision, not Miguel's corruption, but something that was finally, authentically mine. I walked out of that study, out of that house, into the November afternoon that smelled of jasmine and possibility. The past would always be part of me, with all its complications and wounds, but I'd stopped letting it define my future. And that, more than any revenge, felt like justice.